They didn't even lower their voices when they said it. "She'll break the pew. Hope the floorboards hold. Is that her veil or the church curtain?" The words came like little knives, tossed with laughter as Maren climbed the chapel steps, dress clutched in her trembling hands. She was sweating through the lace already, her cheeks redder than the rouge she'd nervously dabbed on that morning. The man she was supposed to marry, Seth, stood at the altar, shifting from foot to foot, eyes locked on the floor. He hadn't even offered to escort her in. When she reached for the handle, it didn't budge. A deacon's voice snapped from behind the door, muffled but cruelly clear. "We won't have her make a mockery of the Lord's house. This wedding is off." Just like that. No face-to-face, no warning. Maren stood frozen, the bouquet slipping from her fingers. A group of guests trickled out the side exit, smirking, not even trying to hide it. Her uncle grabbed her arm and said something about dignity, about going home quickly, but she didn't hear him. She only saw the door that wouldn't open, and the man who hadn't stopped it. Hours later, after the sun had dipped and the chapel lights had gone dark, she was still sitting at the back of the church, veil discarded beside her, dress torn at the hem. That's when she heard boots, measured, slow, coming up the gravel. She looked up to see a cowboy she'd seen once or twice in town. Quiet, broad-shouldered, never said much. He didn't look at her with pity or curiosity, just a soft kind of stillness in his eyes. "Name's Calder," he said simply. "You dropped this." He held out her bouquet, now wilted but intact. She stared at it, then him. "Why'd you come?" she asked hoarsely. He hesitated, then said, "I was there. I heard them, but I saw something else." He knelt and took a breath. "I saw someone who stood taller than any of them, just for walking alone." Maren blinked hard. She hadn't cried all day, but something in his voice cracked her open. Calder reached into his coat, pulled out a small tin, and handed it to her. Inside was a sugar biscuit. "My ma used to say you feed someone first when you don't know what else to say. I'll wait out here with you, if that's all right." And somehow it was. He didn't say much. Just sat a few feet away, cross-legged in the dirt, hat resting on one knee, as Maren broke off tiny pieces of the biscuit and let them melt slowly in her mouth. The church behind her stood like a tomb, its windows dark, its door forever closed in her mind. But Calder was still there. Still real. The night had turned cold, and she pulled what was left of her shawl tighter around her shoulders, aware of every tear in her wedding dress, every stain. "You can go," she said eventually, forcing her voice steady. "I'm not some lost calf needing rescue." He nodded. "Didn't figure you were." And yet he didn't move, just looked out toward the horizon like he had time enough to wait for the world to heal. Maren studied him in the moonlight. His face was rough but clean. Not young, not old. A man who'd seen enough to know when to keep quiet. "Why'd you care what happened to me?" she asked, more curious than bitter. He shrugged. "Guess I know what it's like to be locked out of places, and to know you don't belong, even when you should." Something tightened in her chest at that. "They said I was too big for a church," she whispered, mostly to herself. "Too much woman for one man." Calder's eyes met hers then, not flinching. Or maybe too much woman for a coward. She hadn't expected that. A laugh barked out of her, short and wet. She wiped her face with the edge of her torn sleeve, surprised she was even laughing at all. "You always talk like this?" "Only when I mean it," he said. The quiet returned, but it wasn't the same kind. It wasn't empty anymore. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. "Wagons tied by the creek. Alone? Always. By choice? Until now." He stood, stretched a little, then looked down at her with a strange kind of reverence, like she wasn't a ruined bride, but something precious carved from grief and pride. "If I came back tomorrow," he said slowly, "and asked you to walk again, but not to a church and not for anyone else, just beside me, would you consider it?" Maren didn't answer right away, but her hand closed around the tin biscuit box. She wasn't ready to stand again. Not yet. But something in her legs remembered how. "You come back tomorrow," she said, "and maybe I will." When Maren woke the next morning, the dew was thick on the chapel steps, and her bones ached with the cold. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, Calder's quiet voice, his offer to return. But then she saw it. A tin coffee pot, still warm, set gently by her side. And a second biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief that smelled faintly of wood smoke and mint. He'd come. And he'd left kindness like a letter folded under a door. She sat up slowly, still sore in all the places shame burrows deep, and took her time eating. No one else from the town came, not even to whisper. She was invisible again, but in a way that no longer hurt quite as much. By mid-morning, she saw him, riding slow from the east road, a quiet figure on a chestnut gelding, reins loose in one hand, the other holding something wrapped in oilcloth. Maren stood before she meant to, brushing dust from her skirts, suddenly aware of every crease, every line. He dismounted with the ease of a man born in the saddle and offered her the bundle without a word. Inside was a wool cloak, thick and patched but clean. "You looked cold," he said simply. She stared at it for a long time before taking it. "You always bring gifts to women left at the altar?" "Just the ones worth picking up," he said, then paused. "I mean—" "I know what you meant," she said, cutting off his apology with a wry smile. "And I'll take it, thank you." He nodded, then added, "I'd like to show you something, if you're willing." "Where?" 10-minute ride, 15 if you don't trust my horse." Maren hesitated. She hadn't ridden in years, not since she was thinner, lighter, less likely to draw snickers from stable hands. But when she looked at him, really looked, she saw no pity, just the kind of patience that steadies wild colts. "Lead the way," she said, and he helped her mount with a firm hand and no unnecessary talk. They rode in silence through the hills behind town, where wild lupines still bloomed despite the season. And just as she was about to ask where they were going, Calder pointed ahead, to a plot of land, fenced in with fresh posts, a small cabin frame half built in the middle. "Yours?" she asked, startled. "Ours, maybe, if you want to finish it with me." She looked at the frame, then at him, then at her own hands, calloused but strong. "Why me?" "Because I'm tired of building things alone," he said. And something inside her, a part long buried, answered back. By noon, the whole town was buzzing. Mrs. Elcott saw Calder ride back through Main Street with Maren behind him, still wearing the cloak he gave her. Mr. Tidwell from the Mercantile said he saw her smiling. Smiling. As if the girl who'd been called a burden, who wasn't allowed to step through the church doors, suddenly had something to live for. And by supper time, the whispers turned into questions, and questions into quiet unease. Because if Calder Shaw, the widowed cowboy who never so much as tipped his hat at a woman in 3 years, had chosen her, then maybe they'd been wrong. Maybe she wasn't something to laugh at after all. But Calder didn't care what they said. And neither, surprisingly, did Maren. She had spent years trying to be smaller, quieter, thinner, less visible. But sitting beside Calder on the porch of that half-built cabin, sweat still on her brow from helping him raise another beam, she felt no urge to shrink. "You were good with the hammer," he said, handing her a cold jar of spring water. "I was raised with 4 brothers. If you didn't learn tools, you didn't eat." 4? And a father who said girls were for sewing and silence. "I take it you disagreed." "I took the plow at 12 and never gave it back," she said, then added softly, "Didn't matter." Still wasn't enough for the town. Or for my fiancé, apparently. Calder didn't ask about the man who left her. Didn't ask his name. Just let her words settle like dust in the warm evening air. "They didn't deserve you," he said finally, and neither did he. She looked over at him, not sure whether to believe him. "You say that now. Wait till they start talking." "They already have." "And? And I built this cabin with space for 2 chairs on the porch, not 1. I won't change that because someone behind a curtain thinks I should." For the first time in days, Maren laughed. Really laughed. Not bitter or forced, but warm and surprised. And it felt so foreign, she clutched her stomach like it might burst open from the sound. That night, she didn't go back to the chapel. She stayed, on a blanket of pine wool and straw inside the unfinished cabin. No promises, no romance, just safety, just dignity. And in the morning, she was the one who lit the fire before he came back from checking the herd. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Starting early," she said. "This place won't build itself." And Calder, silent as ever, just nodded. Then handed her the hammer. The sun cracked through the unfinished roof as Maren swept sawdust from the half-laid floor. Calder had gone to town for nails and salt, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to be seen alone. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, hair tied up with a strip of old calico. She was flushed, focused, and strong. That's how Rosa Elcott found her, sitting cross-legged, sanding a splintered windowsill like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're building a home?" Rosa asked, cautiously stepping over the stacked beams. "With Calder," Maren replied. "You're staying?" It wasn't an insult, just disbelief wrapped in politeness. "If he'll have me," Maren said without pause. Rosa bit her lip. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled something folded, delicate blue fabric trimmed with hand-sewn lace. "My sister's dress. She never wore it. Thought you might need something for Sunday?" Maren stared at it like it was a ghost. "I wasn't allowed in the church, remember?" Rosa looked down. "That wasn't right. My mama always said weight was just proof you survived more winters than most." The words hit Maren hard, unexpectedly kind. She accepted the dress with trembling hands, afraid even now to unfold it. That evening, when Calder returned, she didn't mention Rosa or the gift, but she did lay the dress across the makeshift bed of blankets. He glanced at it, then at her, and asked nothing. He never pushed, never prodded, just said, "We can hang a curtain near the spring if you want to wash it." 2 days passed. Then Sunday came. The church bell rang through the pines, clear and insistent. Calder stood by the cabin's only mirror, straightening the collar of a clean shirt. When Maren stepped from behind the partition in Rosas Dress, the world fell still. The fabric hugged her curves gently, not hiding her but honoring her. Her cheeks were red with nervousness, hands fidgeting. Calder didn't say a word, just looked at her like a man seeing the shape of the life he'd forgotten he could want. "Ready?" he asked. "To be stared at again?" "To be seen properly," he said. They walked to the chapel together. No one laughed, no one whispered. The preacher paused mid-sermon when they entered, then smiled and nodded. And Maren, for the first time since she was 13, walked all the way down the aisle. Not for a wedding, not for forgiveness, just to sit beside a man who looked at her like she was already whole. By the time the final hymn had ended, and the congregation filtered out into the dirt path beyond the chapel steps, Maren was already a different woman than the one who'd stepped in. Not because of what had been said during the service, she barely remembered the preacher's words, but because of what hadn't been said. No one had chuckled when the pew creaked beneath her. No one had shifted away. And when Mrs. Trask, the oldest woman in town, offered her hand and said, "You have a strong walk, child," Maren nearly cried. Calder stayed close, not hovering, not shielding her, just close, like he was her place now. As they lingered near the side rail, Pastor Emery approached with his old, weathered ledger under one arm, and a smile that looked like it had seen too much sin to bother with judgment. "I realized I never added you," he said, flipping open to the back. "Folks been attending months. I should know your name proper." Maren blinked. "Mine?" "Yours," he said, dipping his pen. "It's Maren Bly." "Bly?" Emery raised a brow toward Calder, who answered without hesitation. "It will be Holt by winter." The pastor just nodded, as if that settled some unspoken matter. As they turned to leave, Rosa caught up, cheeks pink from chasing her younger siblings. "There's a social next week," she blurted. "Pie contest and dancing. You should come." Maren hesitated. "I don't dance?" "Neither do I," Rosa smiled. "We'll both just stand there and pretend to like music." It was an awkward kind of kindness, but it was real. That night Maren sat at the edge of the bed and asked Calder, quietly, "Why didn't you ever ask me to marry you?" He looked up from the book he'd been reading by lantern light. "You never needed me to. I knew you were staying." "But you said to the pastor, because I figured it's what you wanted, and I wasn't going to let that dress be your last first." She touched his arm then. Just touched it. Not for heat or comfort, but to ground herself. "I don't want people to think you're settling." "Let them think what they want," he said, gently pulling her hand toward his heart. "I know what I've been given." Outside, the coyotes howled like a distant choir, and the wind shook the half-nailed shutters. But inside that small cabin of cedar and truth, a woman who'd once been told she'd never belong had just been written into the church's book as part of the town. And that was something no gossip could erase. Maren had never baked for anyone but herself. It wasn't that she didn't know how. It was that no one had ever asked. But Rosa had shown up 2 days before the social with a sack of fresh apples and a smile that left no room for refusal. "If you don't enter, Miss Pris Delilah will win again, and I can't live through another year of her pecan gloat." So Maren peeled, sliced, and simmered. She mixed the crust by feel, not measurement, just the way her mother used to. As the pie baked, the scent of cinnamon and butter drifted through the house until Calder wandered in from chopping wood, sniffed the air, and said with half a grin, "Well now, you've officially become more dangerous than a storm." Maren brought the pie to the churchyard in a borrowed basket, her hands trembling as if she were delivering something far more precious than dessert. The long table was already crowded with perfect meringues, thick-crusted cobblers, and even a strange custard one woman claimed was a Missouri secret. Maren's pie sat on the end like it didn't know whether it belonged. When the tasting began, most people passed hers by, but then the mayor's wife tried a bite. She paused, took another, called her husband over, and just like that, the whispers changed flavor. Delilah, in her embroidered yellow gown, sniffed and made a comment about rustic presentation. But it was too late. The judges were already asking who made the apple slice that tasted like memory. When they announced Maren's name as the winner, the crowd clapped, some politely, some surprised. But Rosa whooped loud enough to wake the mountains, and Calder just tipped his hat like he'd known it all along. After the event, Delilah cornered her near the cider stand. "You really think pie makes you one of us?" she hissed. Maren didn't flinch. "No," she said softly. "But kindness might." That night, Calder didn't ask how it went. He just handed her a ribbon he'd carved from wood with the words "best of what matters" burned into it. "You didn't have to," she said. "I didn't," he replied, "but I wanted to." And maybe that was the difference between the world she came from and the one she was learning to claim. Not what people were forced to do, but what they chose to give. A ribbon, a pie, a name in a ledger. One by one, she was earning her place. Not by shrinking, but by showing up exactly as she was. The autumn dance was not something Maren had planned to attend. She had no dress, no shoes for it, and certainly no expectation of being asked. But Rosa insisted, dragging her by the hand down to the church hall, where lanterns swung like fireflies and fiddle music pulsed like a heartbeat. Maren stood near the wall, arms folded, trying not to compare herself to the women twirling gracefully across the wood floor. Their skirts flared, their laughter soared, and not a single one of them looked like her. She had just turned to leave when Calder stepped through the crowd. His sleeves were rolled up, suspenders tugged over broad shoulders, and his hair slightly damp from effort. He must have walked straight from the field. "I was hoping I'd find you still here," he said. "Why?" she asked, blinking. "You don't strike me as a man who dances." He smiled, not wide, but deep. "I ain't. But I figure maybe neither of us has to be good at it to enjoy it." Before she could argue, he held out his hand. And something about the way he waited, not pushing, not pleading, just steady, made her nod. The music shifted to a slow tune. Fiddle met harmonica, and the crowd gave way as Calder led her into the open. They moved awkwardly at first. Maren's boots weren't made for spinning, and her body still held too much memory of mockery. But Calder's hand on her back was firm, not forceful. His gaze never wavered. He didn't flinch when she stumbled. He simply adjusted, as if the only rhythm that mattered was the one they made together. A hush settled over the room. Not cruel, not mocking, just surprised. Maren caught sight of Delilah near the refreshment table, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. But she didn't look away. Not this time. As the song drew to a close, Calder leaned in, voice low. "You still think you don't belong?" She swallowed hard. "I still think it's not easy." "Nothing worth it ever is," he said. "But you're worth it." The words settled into her chest like the final note of a hymn. When the applause came, soft but real, she didn't shy away. She curtsied, awkward but proud, and took Calder's arm as they left the floor. That night, Maren walked home barefoot, shoes slung over her shoulder, heart lighter than it had ever been. And though no crown had been placed upon her head, she felt, for the first time in her life, like she'd just been named queen of something she could finally believe in. Herself? There it was again, the wedding dress. Still wrapped in brown paper, still tucked high on the shelf in Miss Lila's shop. Maren had seen it weeks ago when she came in for new thread. It had caught her eye not because of lace or silk, there wasn't any, but because it was simple, sturdy, and made with care. It was custom-made, Lila had said then, but the bride ran off. Shame, really. Beautiful stitching. Maren never asked the price. She hadn't dared. But that morning something inside her shifted. Maybe it was Calder's hand still lingering in hers as they parted last night. Maybe it was the way people had nodded at her in town today. Less like they pitied her, and more like they saw her. So she went back. Lila raised an eyebrow when the bell rang. "Back for more thread?" "Back for that dress," Maren said. "I want to try it." Lila hesitated. "You sure?" "I'm sure." The dress wasn't pristine anymore. Time had yellowed the edges, and a button was missing from the collar. But when Maren stepped behind the curtain and tugged it over her shoulders, something miraculous happened. It fit. Not tight, not pulling, not begging her to shrink. It hugged her softly. And in the mirror, for the first time, she didn't just look like someone trying on a dream. She looked like someone living it. "Well, I'll be," Lila murmured. "It was always meant for someone brave." Maren looked at her reflection, blinking fast. "Do you think I look like yourself?" Lila said firmly. "And that's more than enough." Maren didn't buy the dress that day. Lila wouldn't take her money. "Consider it a gift," she said, "from one woman to another who had to wait too long to be seen." Walking home, Maren passed the church. A group of girls stood nearby, Delilah among them. Their laughter died when they saw her. One of them nudged the other, whispering something cruel. But this time Maren didn't duck her head. She didn't speed up. She just walked past, chin lifted, sunlight catching the quiet strength in her eyes. She didn't need their approval. She had something steadier. Something real. When she reached Calder's porch, he was already outside, a flower pot in one hand, dirt on his cheek. He looked up. His smile was slow and warm. "That's a fine dress," he said. "Thinking of wearing it somewhere special?" "I am," Maren replied, voice steady. "Somewhere I finally belong." And that night, with nothing but a breeze and the stars above them, Calder kissed her, gently, reverently, like she was the beginning of everything he'd ever hoped for. They hadn't planned a ceremony. No invitations, no pastor, no aisle. But that Sunday morning, as dawn stretched gold over the valley and dew still clung to the wheat grass, Calder took Maren's hand and led her to the place he'd been building for weeks. A small platform beneath the cedar tree, just big enough for two, decorated only with wildflowers and pine. Maren wore the dress Lila had given her, the one no one else had dared to wear. Calder wore his best shirt, creased at the cuffs, soft from years of use. There was no music, only the wind. No guests, except a handful of neighbors who came quietly, uninvited but welcomed, because they had changed too. They had seen Maren carry firewood when others stared. They'd watched her hold Calder's mother's hand the day she died. And they'd noticed how Calder smiled wider, stood taller since Maren moved in. When she stepped onto that platform, people didn't whisper about her size. They didn't joke. They just stood still, awed by something they couldn't name but felt deeply. The preacher was Calder's uncle, who spoke little and meant every word. "What God shapes," he said, "no man can mock." And when Calder said, "I do," he didn't look nervous. He looked home. But it was Maren's vow that brought the hush, the breath caught in everyone's throat. "I once believed I was too much," she said softly. "Too loud, too big, too strange to be loved. But then I learned. My strength wasn't a burden. It was a gift waiting to be seen." She turned to Calder. "And you saw it. Not after I changed, but exactly as I was." When they kissed, the valley didn't cheer. It just listened, as if even the earth understood that something true had just taken root. Afterward, they shared bread and stew with those who stayed. Children ran between tables. Calder's neighbors clinked mugs and asked how Maren had gotten the sourdough so soft. No one mentioned the old days. No one brought up the past. It was as if, finally, the town had caught up to the truth Maren carried all along. That dignity isn't something you earn by shrinking. It's something you claim by standing tall. That night, as the fire crackled low and the guests faded back to their homes, Calder pulled Maren close beneath a wool blanket on their porch. "You knew this would happen," he murmured. She smiled, resting her head on his chest. Number I just stopped believing the people who said it couldn't. And with the stars watching gently overhead, they sat in silence. Two souls, finally at peace, wrapped in the promise they built with nothing but courage, patience, and love. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. Would you have stood up for her at the church doors? Tell us in the comments.